Thanks very much, Anthony. The Mohist canon in ancient Chinese philosophy from the late 4th to the 3rd century BC describes how time and space are unified. And I quote, "The movement of things must pass through a certain space and time, from this place at this time to that place at that time. For instance, from south to north, from dawn to dusk. The passing of time and changes in space are closely interrelated, so space and time are unified in the motion of matter," unquote. In fact, the ancient Chinese never disentangled the notion of space from the notion of time. Space was time, and vice versa, in a totally interactive way. Einstein, in formulating his theory of relativity, may also have stumbled across this Taoist connection. The speed of light, for example, is the compression of space and the beginning of time travel. Like physics, novels have attempted to explore this confluence of time and space in both action and stasis. For example, Swiss writer Robert Walser spent much of his life walking through Switzerland. He died while trudging in snow near the town of Herisau. And according to Susan Sontag, and I quote, "He had the depressive fascination with stasis and with the way time distends, is consumed, and spent much of his life obsessively turning time into space," unquote. What is significant in modern literary novels, as distinct from much science fiction, is that these nodes of time and space operate not as content but as form, where language and imagination can affect experience. Often this emotional affect is both pleasurable and anxiety-making, having as its parallel a powerful admixture of sex and death that brings presence to the novel, the presence of a mind, the real presence of language, and what the Germans would call Stimmung, mood, atmosphere, bodily receptions. Thomas Mann's Death in Venice is a prime example. If one reads with the body in mind, this means paying attention to language, to its rhythms and breaths, and its careful calibration of verbal tenses. Reading is in itself a philosophy of corporeal space and time. Language is in the world as a body, not deconstructed out of existence. It is both inside and outside the text, and it refers to the world in its immediacy beyond the ordinary conceptual constructs of space and time. According to Michel Foucault, ancient Chinese bedroom treatises were somewhat Antipodean to that which one finds in classical Greece. According to the ancient Chinese, the anxiety of the male losing his semen could be countered by a willful retention accomplished via the stopping of time and the revisiting of space, a fortunate longevity, a detour from the climactic moment, which was, in Foucault's words, quote, "a time that terminated the act, aged the body, and brought death," unquote. As Catherine England put it more succinctly, "If you never come, you never go." Now, these things preoccupied me at the time of writing my 4th novel after China. In 1991, I was living in a very tiny house in the Blue Mountains outside of Sydney. Next door was a family of rednecks who threatened to poison my dogs, bulldoze my backyard, and held all-night parties with much whooping and yelling. Country and Western music flooded the peaceful bushland. And like Robert Walser, I needed stasis with a novelistic control over time and space. In fact, I needed a hiatus before I moved house. So I wrote After China in 6 weeks, without hope, but with a mind with a kind of epiphany that approximated being lost in deep bush in the Blue Mountains on a final walk. It is a very small book, just 150 pages long. In this novel, a Chinese architect who had been physically and mentally damaged by the Cultural Revolution in China wins a contract to build a seaside hotel in Australia's northeastern coast. He meets an Australian woman with whom he forms a relationship. Unbeknownst to him, she is dying of cancer. He tells her stories of ancient China, spiced with sexual innuendo, with inconclusive and anticlimactic moments which he has invented himself. This literary form of seduction without satisfaction, well documented since the Scheherazade, is given another twist. He doesn't tell stories to seduce anyone or to keep himself alive, but to keep writing alive. And every time he relates them, the woman is reinvigorated and given a new lease on time. It is the power of language and story. A story is willful restraint, both in its way of telling, in its choices, and what it makes in its choices, and in memory, in its choices of retention. The architect builds his hotel like stories, its stories partly set in water, where there is a sunken bar in which one can commune with fish, but which also contains a proviso, water inlets, so that the hotel can be flooded in case of a crisis. It is his contract with grandeur and impermanence. Again, like the ambiguity of time and space, the ancient Chinese understood the ambiguity of harboring false hope, at the same time willing on catastrophe. This isthmus of a middle state, which is also very much, I think, the pathology of modern life, seeks belief and transcendence as comforts. It is very much a subjective stance that precludes being in the world. As we know so well, romantic love ends, life ends, stories must end. The Splendide Hotel floods and the architect is left with the woman's young child. Life begins again after catastrophe, after China. But now the architect is in the world. So that is a crude synopsis of my novel, which perhaps embodies the larger idea of an imaginary China as a symbolic watershed between tragic private lives and a social phenomenon of unimaginable scale. One of the thinkers whom I called upon in writing this novel was the Dutch Orientalist, and this term once had a lot more burnish, diplomat, musician, and writer, best known for his Judge Dee historical mysteries, the protagonist of which he borrowed from the 18th century Chinese detective novel Die Gung. Robert Hans van Gulik was born in 1910 in Zutphen, the Netherlands, and died in 1967 in The Hague. His claim to fame was the movie Judge Dee and the Monastery Murders, adapted from his novel of the same name. As with many thinkers who indulged in writing novels, he was overlooked, having to maintain a day job as a professor. As the author of A Sexual Life in Ancient China, wherein he detailed a compendium of some of the greatest secrets of Chinese sexual practice, he demonstrated the power of scholarship and popular culture in influencing more illustrious thinkers like Michel Foucault. In Van Gulik's book, many of the sexual passages were written in Latin, perhaps out of prurience, but I would presume otherwise, that because in Latin the verb comes at the end of the sentence, the climax is delayed with a conceptual retrospectivity. One must wait and work at deciphering it with willful retention. It is time travel of a different sort. It may also be a question of how Chinese are we in the act of reading. Thank you.